The day Anna Morgan rode into the high country of the Colorado Rockies in the autumn of 1874, the sky was the particular shade of bruised purple that warned even seasoned travelers to find shelter before nightfall, and she had not the faintest idea that the taciturn, broad-shouldered man watching her from the tree line would one day be the reason she stopped running. She had been running for the better part of 3 months. Running from a failed engagement in St. Louis, from a father who had bartered her future to a banker she despised, from a life that felt like a dress sewn for someone else's body, too tight across the chest and too loose everywhere it mattered. She had taken every dollar she owned, which amounted to $47 and some loose coin, and she had boarded a westbound train in August with nothing but a carpetbag, a second-hand rifle she barely knew how to use, and a stubbornness that her mother had once called her greatest gift and her greatest curse in the same breath. She had made it as far as the town of Ridgecrest, Colorado, a scattering of timber-framed buildings clinging to the base of the San Juan Range like barnacles on a rock. Ridgecrest was the kind of town that existed because geography demanded it, a pass-through point for miners heading higher and trappers coming lower, with a general store, a saloon, a livery, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway who charged fair rates and asked few questions, which suited Anna perfectly. It was in Ridgecrest that Anna had made a mistake, not the mistake of trusting the wrong person, though that came later. The first mistake was simple and almost embarrassingly common. She had agreed to carry a letter north into the mountains for a man named Silas Drummond, who operated what he called a trading post, but what the sheriff of the nearest county would have recognized as something considerably less legal. The letter, Silas had assured her, was correspondence for a mining concern. She would be paid $3 for the delivery, and $3 was $3 when you were watching your savings dwindle. She had not asked enough questions. She had simply loaded her rented horse, a wall-eyed gray mare named Pepper, with the provisions she needed, tucked the letter into her saddlebag, and ridden north on the narrow trail that climbed through the aspens and spruce toward a higher elevation where the air tasted like iron and ice. The storm caught her at roughly 4,000 feet above the valley floor, which in the mountains meant somewhere in the middle of a corridor of ancient lodgepole pines that offered precious little shelter from a wind that came down from the peaks with the single-minded fury of something that did not care in the slightest whether Anna Morgan lived or died. Pepper spooked at a crack of thunder and threw her. Anna hit the ground hard, rolled down a short embankment, and came to rest against a deadfall log with the wind knocked entirely out of her and the rain beginning to fall in cold, earnest sheets. She lay there for a moment that felt much longer, staring up at the dark canopy of trees while the sky lit up and split apart overhead, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her, "I have made a considerable number of errors in judgment recently." She was still lying there, cataloging those errors, when a shadow fell over her that was not caused by clouds. "You are going to want to get up," said a voice. It was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had spent most of its life talking to mountains and trees rather than people. "Ground this wet, this high. You will be hypothermic before morning if you stay down." She looked up. The man standing over her was large, not in a threatening way, but in the way that men who spent their lives doing physical labor in cold places became large, which is to say that every part of him appeared to have been built for use rather than appearance. He wore a heavy canvas coat dark with rain, a broad-brimmed hat shedding water in small rivers from its brim, and an expression that was not unkind, but was also not particularly warm. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with a jaw darkened by several days of beard growth and eyes the pale, particular gray of river ice in late winter. He was holding a lantern in one hand and her rented horse's reins in the other. "I caught your horse," he said. "She is unhurt." Anna got up. She was cold and wet and her left hip ached from the fall, but her pride ached worse. "Thank you," she said. "I did not need you to catch her." The man looked at her in the rain for a moment. "All right," he said. Then he handed her the reins and turned to walk away. "Wait," Anna said, because pride was one thing and dying in a mountain rainstorm in Colorado was another. "Is there shelter near here?" He stopped walking but did not turn around immediately. When he did, he looked at her with those pale eyes in the lantern light, and she had the unsettling sensation of being assessed very thoroughly and very honestly. "My cabin," he said, "half a mile north." "I appreciate the offer," Anna said carefully, because she was a single woman alone in a wilderness, and she was not naive about what that sometimes meant. He seemed to understand without her having to explain. "I will sleep in the barn," he said simply. "The cabin has a stove, you will not freeze." That was how Anna Morgan came to spend her first night in Dexter Walden's cabin, listening to the storm rage against the logs while she sat wrapped in a wool blanket in front of a cast-iron stove that radiated heat like a small, contained sun, drinking the darkest, strongest coffee she had ever tasted in her life, and looking around at the interior of a life she had not expected. The cabin was single-roomed but not small, built with the kind of careful attention that suggested the man who had built it intended to stay. The logs were fitted precisely, chinked with clay against the cold, and the interior was orderly in the way of a person who lived alone and had made peace with solitude. There were shelves of tools and traps, neatly arranged. There were books, more books than she would have guessed, stacked along one wall with the spines showing. Natural histories, a battered Bible, several volumes of poetry, a handful of dime novels that looked considerably more read than the poetry. There was a work table with a half-finished snowshoe frame clamped to it, the wood pale and sweet-smelling even from across the room. There was one window, currently shuttered against the storm. There were no photographs, no decorations, no evidence of a woman's presence or absence. There was only the man's life, reduced to its essentials, clean and spare and unexpectedly beautiful in the way that honest things often are. In the morning the storm had passed, and Dexter Walden knocked on his own cabin door before entering, which struck Anna as both courteous and faintly absurd. He was carrying a pan of biscuits he had made over a fire in the barn, and he set them on the table without ceremony. "You are heading up to the Hargrove claim," he said. It was not quite a question. Anna looked at him sharply. "How do you know that?" "There is only one reason Silas Drummond sends anyone north this time of year," he said. He sat down on the bench at his work table and picked up the snowshoe frame, resuming his work with the practiced ease of a man who thought better with his hands occupied. "The Hargrove claim is in dispute. Drummond has been trying to squeeze the Hargrove brothers out for 2 seasons now. Whatever is in that letter is not mining correspondence." Anna felt the cold slide of understanding settle in her chest. "You know Drummond." "Everyone in this part of the mountains knows Drummond," Dexter said. "The question is whether they owe him anything. And do you?" He looked up from the snowshoe frame. "No," he said. "Do you know what is in the letter?" "No. But I know what Drummond is trying to accomplish." He looked at her steadily. "You should not deliver it." Anna considered this. She was sitting at his small table with a tin cup of that extraordinary coffee warming her hands, wearing her slightly damp but mostly dry dress, and she was thinking about $3 and integrity and the specific frustration of having made yet another poor decision in a season full of them. "If I do not deliver it," she said, "Drummond will want his money back, which I have already spent on provisions." Dexter was quiet for a moment. "I know the Hargrove brothers," he said. "I can take the letter to them myself and explain the situation. They will want to know what Drummond has been sending. And Drummond will not come up into the high country to argue the matter. He does not like altitude." "That is a great deal of trouble for a stranger," Anna said. Dexter set down the snowshoe frame and looked at her with those river-ice eyes. "You are not in a position to be proud about accepting help," he said, without any cruelty in it, only a plain assessment that was somehow worse than cruelty because it was accurate. She opened her mouth to argue and closed it again. "No," she admitted, "I suppose I am not." His name was Dexter Walden, and he had lived in these mountains for 7 years, which in 1874 was long enough to have become part of the landscape in the way that only happened when a person chose solitude with their whole will, and not as a consolation prize. He had come west from Tennessee at 25, following no particular dream but moving away from several particular griefs, and he had found in the high country something that he could not have named precisely but that felt, when he was honest with himself, like the closest thing to peace he had ever known. He was a trapper and a fur trader, and in the seasons when the fur trade was thin, he took on work as a guide for the surveying parties that moved through the mountains with their instruments and their optimism, mapping land that had belonged to the Ute people for centuries, and was now being measured and parceled and argued over in ways that Dexter watched with a discomfort he rarely articulated but felt often. He had traded fairly with the Ute bands he encountered, had learned enough of their language to communicate respect if not fluency, and had never participated in any of the land seizures or the violence that accompanied the expansion of white settlement into the high country, though he was also honest enough with himself to know that his mere presence was part of a pattern he did not fully endorse. He had never once asked a woman to stay. This was not because women had not come through his life. There had been a woman in Ridgecrest 3 years back, a school teacher from Ohio named Margaret, who had found him interesting for one full winter and had left in the spring without much ceremony. There had been a woman in Santa Fe before that, during a season when he had come down from the mountains with more money and fewer reasons to stay remote. He had liked them both. He had not loved either of them in the way that the word love, when he encountered it in his books, seemed to demand of a person. He had always assumed this meant he was not built for it. The mountains were sufficient. The work was sufficient. The long, particular silence of a winter morning when the snow lay unbroken in every direction, and the only sound was the creak of the pines in a light wind, that was sufficient. He had told himself this so many times that he had come to believe it was not a lie. He took the letter from Silas Drummond north to the Hargrove brothers, who were 2 weathered, suspicious men living in a claim cabin on the far side of a ridge that required a full day's ride to cross. He let them open the letter. It was, as he had suspected, a legal notice drafted by a lawyer in Denver, asserting that the Hargrove claim had been filed in error on land under a prior lease held by a company that Drummond had quietly purchased. The notice demanded the Hargrove brothers vacate within 30 days or face removal by legal authority. Elder Hargrove, whose name was Chester, read it twice and then used language that Dexter would not have expected from a man of his apparent years. The younger Hargrove, whose name was Eli and who was perhaps 20, went pale and then angry in the way that young men did when they realized the world was not operating on the principles they had been told it operated on. "He sent a woman to carry this," Chester said. "She did not know what it was," Dexter said. "Where is she now?" "My cabin." Chester looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has known another man for several years and thinks he is finally seeing something interesting. Dexter did not dignify the expression with a response. He told them what he knew about the legal situation, which was considerable more than the average trapper knew, because Dexter had spent his winters reading everything he could lay hands on, including 2 volumes of territorial law he had acquired from a departing judge who had decided Colorado was no place for a man of his sensibilities. The Hargroves had a valid counterclaim if they had their original filing documents. Chester said he had them in a tin box under the floorboards. Dexter told them to write to the land office in Denver directly and to do it quickly. He rode back down the ridge in the late afternoon, with the sun turning everything amber and the aspen leaves shaking gold in the light breeze, and he was thinking about Anna Morgan in a way that was not entirely about practical considerations. She had still been at his cabin when he returned. He had half expected she would be gone, had told himself, in fact, that she probably would be, that she seemed like the kind of woman who would take the opportunity of an empty cabin to reclaim her horse and her dignity, and ride back to Ridgecrest without waiting to say thank you. But she was there, and she had swept the cabin floor while he was gone, which struck him as an unexpectedly personal thing to do in someone else's space, and she had found his Dutch oven and made a stew from the dried beans and salted venison in his pantry stores. "You did not have to do that," he said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand. "You swept out the barn," she said, because she had noticed. It seemed fair. He sat at his table. She ladled 2 bowls of stew and sat across from him. They ate in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was not uncomfortable either. It was the silence of 2 people who were both accustomed to their own company and were finding that shared quiet was not the intrusion they might have expected. "What happened with the letter?" she asked. He told her. She listened carefully, without interrupting, and he noticed that she had the quality of a person who had been trained to be decorative in conversation, to laugh at the right moments, to insert small approving sounds, and had largely abandoned that training, so that what remained was a more honest and direct attention that he found he preferred. "Those brothers," she said when he finished, "will they be all right? If they act quickly and the land office is not in Drummond's pocket," he said, "which I cannot guarantee." "That is not fair," Anna said. "No," Dexter agreed. "Does it happen a great deal out here? People using legal mechanisms to take what does not belong to them?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said, and there was enough weight in the word that she heard what he was not quite saying, that it had been happening for a very long time, and not only to white miners with competing land claims. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am sorry I said I did not need your help with the horse." He shook his head slightly, as if to say it did not matter, but she continued, "I did need it. I have been telling myself for 3 months that I do not need anything from anyone, and it has been getting me further and further into situations where I demonstrably do need things from people." She looked at her bowl. "I think it is easier to be proud than to admit that the world is difficult and one is sometimes lost in it." Dexter said nothing for a moment. Then, "What are you lost from?" And she told him. Not everything, not all at once, but the shape of it, the father instinct. Louis, the banker named Horace Pemberton, who had smooth hands and cold eyes, and a social position that her father considered a fair trade for his daughter's future. The way she had sat in the church where the engagement was to be announced and felt, with a physical certainty that astonished her even now, that she would rather face any hardship the world offered than the specific hardship of becoming Horace Pemberton's wife. "So you ran," Dexter said. "I left," she corrected gently. "There is a difference." He considered this with the focused attention of a man who found language interesting. "All right," he said. "What is the difference?" "Running," she said, "is when you do not know where you are going. Leaving is when you know you cannot stay." He looked at her with those pale eyes, and something shifted in his expression that she could not quite read, not yet, because they were still strangers, still in the careful first hours of knowing someone when everything is surface and possibility. "What did you plan to do?" he asked. "After Ridgecrest." She admitted, with more honesty than she usually allowed herself, that she had not planned beyond Ridgecrest. That she had vague notions of finding work, she could keep accounts, she had a good hand with figures, she had been educated by a mother who believed women should know how to manage money even if the world preferred they pretend otherwise. She had thought perhaps a mining town or a ranch, somewhere she could be useful in ways that did not require her to also be agreeable. "The Hargrove brothers might need someone to keep their claim records," Dexter said, somewhat suddenly. Anna looked at him. He appeared mildly surprised at himself for having said it. "Are you trying to find me employment?" she asked. "Chester Hargrove cannot read," he said, which was not exactly an answer. "Eli is not much better. If they are going to fight a legal battle with a Denver lawyer, they are going to need someone who can read documents and write letters." "I see," Anna said slowly. "It is a thought," Dexter said, and picked up his bowl again in a way that indicated the subject was now concluded for this evening. She stayed 3 more days in the cabin while the early mountain autumn settled around them like a cold, beautiful country she was only beginning to understand. She told herself it was practical Pepper needed to recover from the fall, and the trail south was still muddy from the storm, and she needed to think through her next steps. All of this was true. None of it was the entire truth. The truth, which she only began to apprehend on the second day, was that she was not ready to leave. She had not been ready to be anywhere since August, and yet here in this spare, honest cabin at the foot of the mountains, she felt something that was uncomfortably close to the absence of urgency. She helped Dexter set his trap line one morning. He showed her what he was looking for along the stream banks, how to read the small signs of animal passage, how to move through the forest quietly. She was not good at it yet, but she was not terrible either, and he did not condescend when she made mistakes. On the evening of the second day, they sat on opposite sides of a fire he had built in the small clearing beside the cabin, and she asked him about the books on his shelf. He talked about them more freely than he had talked about anything else, about the natural histories he loved for the way they described the world without sentimentality, about the poetry he read mostly in the winters when the silence could become too large without some human voice to hold it back, even a printed one. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "There is a difference between lonely and alone." "What is the difference?" she asked, using his own phrasing from 2 days before. He looked at her across the fire, and for the first time since she had fallen off her horse in a thunderstorm, he almost smiled. "Lonely is when you want company you do not have. Alone is when you have chosen something that satisfies." "And which are you?" He looked into the fire. "I thought I was alone," he said. The present tense of that sentence, thought, not think, sat between them in the firelight, and Anna felt the back of her neck prickle in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. On the third day, she rode north with him to the Hargrove claim. He had sent word ahead with a note carried by Eli, who had come down to buy provisions, and had been somewhat startled to find a woman in Dexter Walden's cabin, which was apparently remarkable enough in the mountain community to have been discussed at Ridgecrest Saloon with considerable interest. The Hargrove claim was a modest operation, a main shaft with a timber frame, a claim cabin that made Dexter's look palatial, and a stamp mill that had seen better days before Anna was born. Chester Hargrove was a compact, sun-dark man of perhaps 55 with hands so calloused they looked like leather and eyes that assessed everyone with the same blend of suspicion and fairness. He shook Anna's hand when Dexter introduced her, which she noted and appreciated. "Dexter says you can read legal papers," Chester said. "I can," Anna said, "and write letters." "Yes." "You willing to work for wages?" "Yes." "Then you can sleep in the supply room. It has a cot and a stove." He paused. "I will pay you fair. Dexter will tell you if I do not." Anna glanced at Dexter, who was standing slightly to the side in the characteristic posture she had already come to recognize, present but not imposing, watching without appearing to watch. "I believe you," she told Chester. She settled into the supply room at the Hargrove claim in early October of 1874, which was perhaps not the wisest season to establish oneself in a mountain mining operation, but which proved to be, in retrospect, the beginning of everything that mattered. She organized Chester's files, which amounted to a battered tin box containing the original claim documents, several receipts, 3 IOUs from men who were probably in Nevada by now, and a photograph of a woman Anna assumed was Chester's wife, though he never mentioned her. She helped Eli, who was genuinely eager and entirely unashamed of his educational gaps, practice his letters in the evenings using a stub of pencil and the backs of used paper. She wrote the letters to the Denver land office that Dexter had recommended, choosing her words carefully, stating the facts of the claim with the kind of measured clarity that she hoped would be harder to dismiss than an emotional appeal. And Dexter came. Not every day he had his own work, his trap lines to run, his furs to process and eventually take to trade. But he came 3 or 4 times a week, and the Hargrove brothers accepted this without comment, which Anna suspected meant it was unusual enough to be noted, but expected enough to be permitted. He brought things. Dried venison when the Hargrove stores were running low, a spare wool blanket when the temperature dropped hard in mid-October and the supply room proved drafty. A book, one of the natural histories from his shelf, left on the corner of her work table one afternoon while she was outside with Eli, with no note attached, because Dexter Walden was not a man who attached notes to things. She read it. She left it on his saddle when he next visited, with a folded piece of paper inside that said, in her neat accountant's hand. The chapter on migratory birds was particularly fine. He read the note and folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket, and she watched him do this from the doorway of the supply room and felt something warm and complicated take root in her chest. November came with a ferocity that even Chester, who had wintered in the mountains twice before, found impressive. The snow came early and came heavily, layering the claim in white silence that muffled the sound of the stamp mill, and turned the world beyond the windows into an abstract painting of gray tree trunks and white ground, and occasionally the punctuation of a raven crossing the sky. The trail south to Ridgecrest became impassable for 3 weeks in late November, during which time Anna Morgan accepted that she was, definitively and without recourse, staying in the mountains for the winter. She was surprised to discover that this did not frighten her. Dexter came to the claim on snowshoes when the trail closed, which was a 4-mile round trip from his cabin, and which he undertook every 3 to 4 days with the same matter-of-fact regularity with which he did everything. He brought meat and news from his trap line, and he sat in the main cabin with Chester and Eli and Anna and drank coffee and talked more than he talked in other seasons. Anna noticed, though she could not tell if this was because winter brought out a more sociable version of Dexter Walden or because she made him more willing to speak. She chose to believe it was both. One afternoon in December, with the snow falling in the particular thick, windless way that was almost beautiful if you did not need to be anywhere in it, she and Dexter were alone in the supply room. She was reviewing the response from the Denver Land Office, which was cautiously encouraging, and he was repairing a section of her cot frame that had developed an alarming lean, and she asked him something she had been turning over since October. "Why did you help me?" she said. "When I fell off the horse." "You did not know me." He looked up from the cot frame. He had a small hammer and a wooden peg in his hands, and he considered the question with the full seriousness he brought to everything. "You were in the rain," he said. "That is not a reason people are in the rain." "You were going to freeze," he said. "Also not a reason people freeze." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I did not want you to freeze." It was, in its way, the most direct thing he had said to her. She sat with it for a moment, feeling its weight. "Dexter," she said, "I am glad I fell off the horse." He looked at her. His expression was the careful, still expression he wore when he was feeling something he had not yet decided how to address. "I am glad you are not frozen," he said finally. She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed genuinely, freely, without performance, in longer than she could remember, and the sound surprised both of them, filling the small room with something bright and unexpected. And Dexter Walden stared at her with his hammer halfway to the cot frame and his pale eyes very wide, and Anna thought, oh, here it is. Here is the thing I did not know I was looking for." Christmas of 1874 passed quietly at the Hargrove claim. They had no minister and no church, but Chester produced a small pine tree he had dragged in from outside, and Eli made paper decorations from old newspaper, and Anna made a dried apple cake that she considered a reasonable achievement given the available ingredients. Dexter appeared in the afternoon with a brace of rabbits and a bottle of whiskey, and what appeared to be 3 handmade gifts wrapped in brown paper. For Chester, there was a new pipe bowl he had carved from briar root. For Eli, there was a small illustrated primer, the kind meant for children, which Eli accepted with entirely undefended gratitude that said a great deal about his character. For Anna, there was a compass. Brass, old but well-maintained, with a needle that swung true. She turned it in her hands and looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression that was the most open she had ever seen on his face, still guarded at the edges. The way a man's face is when he has been alone long enough that vulnerability has become a habit of concealment, but with something underneath it that was unguarded and hoping. "So you do not get lost," he said. She thought about saying something clever. She thought about deflecting, about making a light remark that would let them both stay safely in the territory where they had been living, warmth without declaration, closeness without commitment. She looked at the compass in her hands, at the needle pointing north as faithful as a promise. "I am not lost," she said quietly. "Not anymore." His jaw tightened slightly. Something moved across his face. He sat down in the chair beside the stove and looked at his hands, and she thought he might say something then, something that would change the shape of everything. But Eli came in from outside with snow on his shoulders and a request about the rabbit preparation, and the moment dissolved. January brought word from Denver. The response from the land office, combined with the documentation Anna had organized and sent, was sufficient to open a formal inquiry into Drummond's prior lease claim. An inquiry was not a victory, but it was a delay, and a delay meant the Hargroves had time. Chester read the news with the controlled relief of a man who does not permit himself hope until it is confirmed, but who has been quietly terrified for months. Eli made a noise that was almost certainly a suppressed whoop. Dexter, who was there when Anna read the letter aloud, said, "Well done." In the quiet, direct way he said things that he meant entirely. That was when she knew she had to either say something herself or accept that she was living in a story where nothing would ever be said. She chose to say something, but she chose the wrong moment. It was a late January evening, with a wind from the north making the cabin timbers groan and the fire burning high. Dexter was getting ready to leave. He had to make it back to his cabin before full dark, and the days were short and the trail was not forgiving. He was pulling on his coat and hat, and she followed him to the door with some practical excuse about the firewood situation. And then when he turned to go, she said, before she could think better of it, "I think I am in love with you." He turned around very slowly. She stood there in the door of the Hargrove claim cabin, with the wind pulling at her hair and the cold pouring around the edges of the doorframe, and she watched him look at her with those gray eyes that she had spent 4 months learning to read, and she watched something happen in them that she could not quite interpret. He looked not frightened exactly, not cold, but sealed, as if a door had closed behind his expression that she could see but not open. He did not say anything for a long moment. The wind howled, the fire popped. "Anna," he said. "You do not have to say anything," she said quickly. "I simply thought it was important for you to know. The way it is important to know which direction is north." He looked at the compass she was holding. She had been carrying it every day since Christmas. She realized he had noticed this, and his expression did something complicated. "I need to get back before dark," he said. "I know," she said. He turned and walked out into the snow. She closed the door and stood there for a moment with her hand on the latch and her heart doing something painful and somewhat embarrassing. And then she went back to the fire and sat down and told herself that she had done the honest thing and that was enough. It was not enough. February was difficult. Dexter came to the claim less frequently, and when he came he was present but more careful, more deliberately courteous, which was in some ways worse than distance, because it had the quality of something managed rather than something felt. He helped Chester repair a section of the mine shaft that had iced. He worked alongside Eli on the stamp mill gears. He drank coffee and he talked about practical things, and he looked at Anna when she spoke and looked away when she did not. She did not say anything more. She had said her piece. She was not going to beg. But she was also, she discovered in the long February nights with the wind outside and the fire inside, beginning to understand something about herself. She had left St. Louis because she refused to live a life that was not her own. She had ridden into the mountains on a fool's errand and found something real in a trapper's cabin and a compass pointing north. She had meant what she said in January. She did not regret saying it. She was only beginning to wonder what she would do if the answer, when it came, was no. March arrived with a sudden shift that the mountains could sometimes perform, 3 days of cold, clear weather with temperatures that felt like an apology for February, and the snow beginning to compact and settle along the trail edges, and a smell in the air that was not quite spring but was not quite winter either. Chester got a reply from Denver, confirming the inquiry would proceed. The Hargrove brothers were going to keep their claim. There was a modest celebration, involving the last of the whiskey and a venison roast that Anna cooked over the main fire while Eli played a fiddle that he had learned 3 songs on, and was attempting a 4th with more enthusiasm than precision. Chester told a long story about a card game in Kansas that had allegedly funded his original journey west. They were all 4 of them warm and a little loud and happy in the uncomplicated way of people who have survived something. Dexter was there. He sat beside Anna on the bench along the cabin wall for most of the evening, close enough that she was conscious of his shoulder near hers. And they talked about the Denver decision, about Chester's story, about the fiddle tune Eli was earnestly murdering. And it felt, in the closeness and the firelight and the relief of the evening, very nearly like everything she had wanted. When the others had turned in and she and Dexter were alone by the dying fire, she told herself she was not going to say anything. She had already said everything she had to say. He said, "I am going to make a trip to trade the winter furs, 2 weeks probably, maybe 3. "All right," she said, "I will be back by mid-April." "I will be here," she said, and then felt the weight of what that meant, that she was still here, still on his mountain, still in the vicinity of his life by choice and not by weather. He looked at the fire. "Anna," he said, "you do not have to, I know I do not have to," he said, with a sharpness that was not anger but was very close to its edges. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I am not good at this." "At what?" He made a gesture that encompassed, she thought, the fire, the room, the 2 of them, possibly everything. "This," he said. "Conversation," she asked carefully. "No," he looked at his hands. "I mean the part where someone is here and I want them to stay." The fire settled. A log fell into ash. The wind outside was very quiet. "Have you wanted that before?" she asked. "No," he said. She sat very still. He continued, looking at his hands. She watched his profile in the firelight, the straight nose and the set jaw and the mouth that she had spent considerable mental energy on over the past months, and she felt the thing that had been growing in her chest since a rainstorm in October expand into something that had no edges. "Dexter," she said. He looked at her. "Say it or do not say it," she said gently, "but decide." He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that the fire died down another degree, and the cold crept in at the door edges, and she began to think he was not going to say it, that this was going to be one of those moments that hung between people like a question mark, and never resolved into either answer. And then he did something she did not expect. He reached over and took her hand, just that, his large, calloused hand covering hers where it rested on the bench, warm and careful and deliberate. He held her hand and he looked at her and he said very quietly, "I want you to stay." She turned her hand over and held his. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "I went about this all wrong," he said, and she heard in his voice the specific frustration of a man who has been conducting an internal argument for months and is only now losing it. "You said what you said in January and I stood there like I was made of pine logs." "You were cold," she said. "The weather was difficult." "I was a coward," he said, which was so startling in its directness that she laughed a little. "I was afraid of wanting something I might not be able to keep." "I have been known to stay when I am asked," she said. He looked at her with those pale eyes warm in the dying firelight, and he said, "Anna Morgan, I think I loved you since you fell off your horse in the rain and told me you did not need my help." She thought about that. "That is a very specific and somewhat unflattering moment to fall in love at," she said. "You were the most honestly yourself I have ever seen a person be," he said. "Proud and wet and absolutely refusing to admit you were frightened. I thought, that woman is going to be remarkable if she survives the night." "I survived the night," she noted. "You did," he agreed. He was still holding her hand. She leaned forward and kissed him, which was the second brave thing she had done in Colorado and considerably more pleasant than the first, which had been telling a large and emotionally reserved mountain man that she was in love with him, and then standing in a cold doorway while he walked away into the snow. He kissed her back with a care that said everything about how much he had thought about this and how seriously he took it. And when they separated, she rested her head against his shoulder and felt, for the first time in the many months since she had stepped off that westbound train with her carpetbag and her stubbornness, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. He left for the fur trade in early April as he had planned, because the trade was his livelihood and the furs needed moving before the spring markets closed. He was gone 22 days. He went to Ridgecrest and then further south to Pueblo, where he had established trade relationships over several years with a merchant named Alvarez who dealt honestly and paid fair prices. He sold the winter's catch, settled his accounts, and on an impulse that surprised him, he walked into a hardware store in Pueblo and spent 20 minutes in front of a glass case looking at something small and practical that he eventually purchased and put in his coat pocket. Anna spent those 22 days doing what she had been doing all winter, helping Chester, tutoring Eli, maintaining the claim records. But she did these things now with a different quality of presence. She was not waiting to leave. She was not managing the experience of somewhere temporary. She was learning the land, the particular colors of the mountain at different hours, the names Chester had for the different winds, the way the ice broke on the creek in a specific sequence that Eli said predicted the spring thaw. She was also writing a letter to her mother, not her father, not yet. But her mother, who had stood in the parlor of their St. Louis house on the morning Anna left and said, very quietly, so her father could not hear, "Be brave, Anna. I always was too afraid to be." She wrote to tell her that she was alive and well and in Colorado, and that she had found work that suited her, and that she was not coming home. She said this last part kindly but without ambiguity, which was the way her mother had taught her to say difficult truths when she was very young, before the world had convinced her to soften them beyond recognition. Dexter returned on a morning when the snow was retreating from the lower slopes, and the aspens were just beginning to show the first pale green of new leaves. He rode in on his horse, a steady bay gelding named Comstock, with his saddlebags lighter of furs and heavier of provisions. He found Anna at the creek edge below the claim, watching the water with the focused, particular attention of someone who was learning to see rather than simply look. "The ice broke 3 days ago," she said before he had fully dismounted. The way Eli described it, the upper section first, then the bend. He was right about the sequence. "He usually is about the creek," Dexter said. She turned around and looked at him, and the thing that happened in her expression when she saw him was worth 22 days of any trade route. He thought, "I am an idiot for every moment I waited." He led Comstock to the picket line and then came back to where she was standing and reached into his coat pocket. "I bought something," he said. "In Pueblo." She looked at his hand. In his palm was a ring, small and plain, silver with a single inset turquoise stone, the pale blue-green of the summer sky at altitude. It was not an expensive ring. It was exactly the right ring. "Dexter Walden," she said. "I am aware this is sudden," he said, which was such an objectively incorrect assessment of the situation that she had to press her lips together not to laugh. "We have known each other for 6 months," she said. "7," he said. "I am being precise." "You are always precise," she said. "It is one of the things I love about you." He looked at her. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "I do not want to do it in a particularly formal way because I am not certain I can manage a great deal of ceremony without making a mess of it. But I want it to be clear. I want you to stay, not because the winter is long or the claim needs someone to read documents, because you are the reason the morning is interesting." She looked at the ring in his hand and then up at his face, and she felt the whole long shape of the past 7 months. The rainstorm and the cabin and the coffee and the compass and the fire and January's courage and February's silence and March's forgiveness and April's green beginning, all of it settling into a shape she recognized now as the shape of something permanent. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger. It fit almost perfectly, which he admitted later was a guess, and which she admitted was an impressive guess for a man who had never done this before. They were married in late May of 1875 by a traveling minister named Reverend Cole, who came through the mountain communities on a circuit twice a year, performing whatever sacraments were needed in an area too remote for a permanent church. The ceremony was held in the small clearing beside Dexter's cabin, which Anna had come to think of as their cabin, because she had moved her belongings in April with the assistance of Eli and a borrowed mule, and because it felt already like the place her life was organized around. Chester Hargrove was present, scrubbed and wearing a coat she had not previously seen him own. Eli was present, with his fiddle, which he played before and after the ceremony with a skill that had improved noticeably since December. A woman named Clara Vasquez was present, who ran the Ridgecrest General Store with her husband and who had befriended Anna over the winter months during Anna's occasional supply trips down the mountain. Clara brought flowers from her kitchen garden, early summer ones that smelled sweetly of the lower elevation, and she wept during the vows with the generous openness of a woman who had been happily married herself for many years and saw the entire institution as a cause for celebration. Dexter said his vows in a low, steady voice that did not waver, looking at Anna's face with the concentrated attention he usually reserved for reading a difficult text. Anna said hers in a voice that was clear and direct, because she had been trained to be soft and had done that badly and was better at direct, and Reverend Cole seemed to appreciate the commitment of the delivery if not its departure from tradition. They were married. Dexter Walden, 33, mountain man, trapper, sometime guide, consistent reader of natural histories and occasional poetry. Anna Walden née Morgan, 26, former accountant's daughter, one-time runaway, current resident of the high country of Colorado, keeper of the Hargrove claim records, owner of a brass compass and a ring the color of altitude sky. The summer of 1875 was the best summer of Dexter's life, a designation he applied with the seriousness of a man who had spent several years being honest with himself and knew the difference between sentimentality and truth. Anna was in his cabin, their cabin, when he came home from the trap line. She had made it hers in ways that were small and thorough, and that he noticed every time. The curtain she had sewn from fabric traded at Ridgecrest for the single window, the way the books had been rearranged not randomly, but thematically, the dried herb bundles hanging from the ceiling rafters that gave the cabin in warm weather a smell of sage and something sweeter. She learned to shoot properly that summer. He taught her, patiently and without condescension, beginning with technique rather than firepower, explaining the mechanics before the practice, and she was a better student than he had expected, focused and precise, correcting her own errors once she understood what she was looking for. She never hunted if she could avoid it, but she wanted to be able to, which he found sensible and did not press. She learned to read the trail signs he used. She learned to build a fire in wet conditions. She was, he thought, learning to live in the mountains rather than simply residing in them, and the distinction was everything. He learned from her too, though he was less immediately aware of this. He learned that thinking out loud to another person was not, as he had assumed, a weakness. That the things he had worked out alone over 7 years in the mountains were sometimes more interesting when tested against someone else's intelligence. That shared meals were different from solitary ones, not inferior, not superior, but different in a way that turned out to matter to him more than he had accounted for. She wrote to her father in August. It was a letter that had taken her all summer to compose, not because she did not know what to say, but because she wanted to say it in a way that was honest without being cruel, which was harder. She told him she was married and well and not coming home. She did not apologize for leaving. She told him she hoped he was well. She told him she was happier than she had known was available to her, and that she held no bitterness toward him, only a clarity about what her own life needed to be. Her father wrote back in October. The letter was stiff and not warm, but it was a letter, which was more than she had expected. He was glad she was alive. He said nothing about the banker Pemberton. He said nothing about coming to visit. He said very little, in fact, but he said it, and she read it twice and put it in the tin box she kept her important papers in, beside the compass. October came, and with it, the first anniversary of the rainstorm that had begun everything. Dexter did not make a ceremony of the date. He was not a man who made ceremonies. But on the evening of the approximate anniversary, he came home from a morning on the trap line with a small bundle of late wildflowers, the last surviving ones before the hard frosts finished them, and he set them on the table without comment, and Anna put them in a tin cup of water and touched his arm as he passed and said, "I know," and he said, "I know you do." That was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. The second winter at the cabin was easier than the first had been at the claim, because this winter they were together in it, and the long silences of mountain February were populated now with two people's warm company. They read in the evenings by lamplight, each their own book, occasionally reading aloud to the other a passage that seemed worth the sharing. They talked more than Dexter had ever talked in his life, he thought, and less than Anna had been trained to, and the place they found between those two things was comfortable and honest. He was a different man in small, specific ways that he could not have predicted. He laughed more, not out of character but out of opportunity. Anna had an unexpected absurdist wit that emerged in the right conditions, and that consistently caught him off guard in the best possible manner. He left the cabin in the mornings with a forward orientation rather than the steady, self-contained endurance that had carried him through his bachelor years. He made plans. He had not made plans before. He had managed winters and worked through springs and moved from one season to the next with competence and equanimity, but without particular direction. Now he was making plans, and the plans involved things like expanding the cabin, and whether the bench in the clearing beside it might be made more comfortable, and spring planting of a kitchen garden. In February of 1876, Anna told him she was going to have a child. She told him in the morning, before he went out to the trap line, while the cabin was cold and the stove was just beginning to warm, and the pale gray pre-dawn light was coming through the curtained window. She told him simply and directly, the way she told him most things of importance. He put down his coffee cup. He sat down. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was to say an expression of something so large and so unheld that his face simply could not contain it in the usual way. He said, "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "Are you frightened?" "A little," she admitted. "Are you?" He looked at his hands on the table. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "I would be concerned if you were not." He reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture he had made in March of the previous year when the fire died down and the cold came in, and she held his hand and they sat in the warming cabin in the early Colorado morning and were frightened together, which was a better way to be frightened than alone. The summer of 1876 brought a son. He was born in July in the cabin, with Clara Vasquez down from Ridgecrest as midwife, a role she had filled before and undertook with the competent authority of a woman who trusted the process, even when the process was difficult. It was difficult. Anna was honest about this afterward, not for complaint but because honesty was her nature. It was hard and it was long, and there were hours in the middle of it when Dexter, who was banished to the porch by Clara's firm instruction, sat on the bench in the summer sun and was more frightened than he had ever been on any mountain in any weather. And then Clara opened the door and said, "Come in. They are both fine," and he went inside, and his wife was tired and triumphant in the way that she was sometimes triumphant, the way that looked like it had cost something real, and in her arms was a red-faced and furiously opinionated small person who had apparently inherited his father's capacity for displeasure with cold and his mother's volume. "He is loud," Dexter observed. "He is yours," Anna said. They named him James, for no particular reason except that it was a solid name, and it suited the solid, serious way he regarded everything around him from his first hours, as if he were assessing the world with a combination of suspicion and interest that was familiar. Dexter held his son in the evenings and was, privately, astonished. He was astonished by the smallness and the completeness of James, by the specific weight of him, by the way the infant would grasp his finger with a grip that contained absolute conviction. He was astonished by the fact that this existed, this child, this woman, this cabin, this life, where 7 years earlier there had been only the mountains and the silence and the self-sufficiency that he had built into a fortress and called it freedom. He thought, on one of those evenings with James asleep against his shoulder and Anna reading by the lamplight, her feet tucked under her and her hair loose, "She found me. I was here and I was not moving and I was not asking anything from the world, and she fell off a horse in a rainstorm, and I caught her horse and she found me." He understood now that the years before her were not wasted. They had made him the man who could recognize what she was when he saw her, and the man who had the good sense, eventually, and after considerable internal argument, to not let her leave. But he was also honest enough with himself to acknowledge that if she had not said it first, in January of that year in the cold doorway, he might have waited forever. Might have kept it inside with the same disciplined containment with which he kept everything, and she might have left in the spring thinking he did not want her, and he might have spent the rest of his life in the mountains being alone rather than lonely, telling himself it was enough. She had said it first. She had always been braver than him in that particular way. He was grateful for it every day. The Hargrove brothers kept their claim. Chester retired from active mining in 1877, when his joints made the shaft work impossible, and sold the operation to a larger company at a fair price. A price made fair in part by the meticulous documentation that Anna had organized for the 2.5 years she had worked for them. Chester used the proceeds to build a small house in Ridgecrest, where he sat on his porch in the afternoon and told stories to anyone who would listen. Eli, at 23, took work as a surveyor's assistant, leveraging the reading and writing skills he had acquired in evening sessions with Anna, and a natural talent for mathematics that had been there all along, waiting only for literacy to unlock it. Silas Drummond's legal claim was dismissed by the Denver Land Office in 1876 for insufficient documentation, which Anna heard about from Clara Vasquez with considerable satisfaction. Their life in the mountains expanded in the way of lives that have found their proper conditions. Dexter added 2 rooms to the cabin in 1877, in the spring and summer months, with Eli's help and Chester's occasional advice from the clearing where he sat in a chair Anna had dragged outside for him. The cabin grew from a single-room refuge into a proper home. A kitchen that Anna said made the cooking considerably less theatrical, a bedroom that was theirs and a second room for James, and eventually for more. In 1878, a daughter arrived. They named her Ruth, and where James was serious and large-eyed and inclined toward observation, Ruth arrived with an apparent agenda and an early mastery of emotional leverage that made both her parents laugh with equal parts admiration and mild concern. Ruth had Anna's dark hair and Dexter's pale eyes, a combination that produced a child of striking and slightly unsettling directness, who at 2 years old was already conducting negotiations with her older brother in a manner that suggested the mountains were going to be considerably less quiet in the coming decade. James, who had initially regarded the newcomer with the skeptical assessment of a child who has been an only child for long enough to have opinions about it, eventually settled into the role of elder brother with a protective devotion that Dexter recognized as something that lived deep in the character. He taught Ruth things when she was old enough to learn them: how to read trail signs, how to find north by the sun at midday, how to be still enough in the forest that the animals forgot you were there. Anna taught her other things, figures and letters, and the particular kind of attention that makes a person useful in the world. Dexter watched all of this and felt something he had never expected to feel, not the absence of the solitude he had loved, but the presence of something that solitude could not provide, which was the specific richness of a life that was happening in multiple dimensions at once. There was always something new to notice. There was always some small discovery being made in his own home, by his own children, in the country he had chosen, and which had now chosen him back through the love of the woman who had found him in it. He told Anna this one evening in 1879, sitting on the bench outside the cabin in the first warm evening of spring, with the children asleep inside and the mountains turning dark above them and the sky doing its Colorado best with the stars. "I have been thinking," he said. "About what?" she said. "About how I used to believe that I was built for solitude," he said. "That I was constitutionally suited to being alone and that this was a kind of superiority. I was proud of needing no one." "I know," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "Or not wrong exactly, I could manage alone and I was not miserable, but I was living at a fraction of the available life. Like reading by poor light because you have forgotten there is a lamp." She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Above them the peaks were dark and massive and permanent, and below them Ridgecrest burned its small lights, and around them the forest breathed in the way it did on spring evenings, as if it too were relaxing after a long cold season. "You did not forget the lamp," she said. "You just had not been given a good reason to light it." "You gave me the reason," he said. "You gave yourself the reason," she corrected gently. "You caught my horse. You took me out of the rain. That was you choosing, Dexter. I just stayed long enough for you to choose all the way." He thought about this in the serious way he thought about everything. Then he said, "We should plant the kitchen garden next week. The ground is thawed enough." She laughed. He smiled, which was still one of the rarer and therefore more valuable things he did, and the lamp of it lit his whole face. The years arranged themselves with the good fortune of lives that have found their proper foundation. The mountain life was not easy. It was never easy, and anyone who told you otherwise was selling something. But it was honest, and honesty was what both of them had always needed most. There were hard winters and lean seasons, and the recurring irritations of living in a territory that was still making its own laws while ignoring older ones. And there were the inevitable small heartbreaks that come to any family. James fell from a tree at 8 and broke his arm in a way that healed well, but required a terrifying trip to a doctor in Pueblo, during which Dexter discovered that he was considerably more frightened of hospitals than of mountains, and Anna discovered that she was considerably less frightened of them than she might have expected. They went together, and this was the important thing. They went together to everything. The Ute people who had used these high mountain passes for generations were being pushed further and further into the reservation system by 1879, and Dexter felt this displacement with a sharpness that he did not always know how to articulate, but that Anna, who had come to understand his particular vocabulary of silences, heard clearly. He had traded fairly with the Ute bands he knew. He had never participated in the violence of removal, but he was honest with her and with himself about the limitations of that distinction, that not participating in injustice while continuing to benefit from its outcomes was a moral position that required more examination than he had previously given it. He could not undo the larger forces at work, but he could be honest about them, which was more than many men in the territory managed, and he could treat the people he knew with the respect and honesty he tried to extend to every transaction of his life. Anna agreed with him on this, and they talked about it in the evenings, sometimes in the way that people talk about large, painful things when they have decided to look at them directly rather than away. It did not resolve, because it was not the kind of thing that resolved. It was the kind of thing that required being held clearly in view. In 1882, Clara Vasquez's husband died of a fever, which was the kind of loss that the mountains periodically took, sudden and non-negotiable. Anna went down to Ridgecrest and stayed with Clara for a week, helping in the store and being present in the way that Clara had been present the night James was born, which is to say being useful with her hands and steady with her presence. Clara was a woman who knew how to grieve without being consumed by it, which Anna admired, and which Clara attributed to 30 years of marriage that had given her enough to grieve well rather than simply for. Dexter came down at the end of the week with the children and helped move some of Clara's storage, and he sat in the evening with Clara and Chester Hargrove, who was still alive and still on his porch and still telling stories, and the four of them drank coffee and talked about the people they missed, which was its own kind of comfort. James was 8 that year, Ruth was 6, and they were becoming themselves in the accelerating way that children do once they have enough language and experience to have preferences. James was like his father in his quietness and his attention, but like his mother in his interest in systems and records. He had begun, without being asked, to help Anna maintain the household accounts with a precision that delighted her. Ruth was like her mother in her directness and her independence, but like her father in her relationship with the land. She could already identify most of the plants in the forest by sight and name, and she had an instinct for animal behavior that Dexter recognized as a gift and was already cultivating. The cabin was full and warm and sometimes chaotic and always alive in the way that Dexter had never known a space could be when he lived in it alone. He thought about this on a cold, clear evening in October of 1883, sitting in the clearing while Anna read inside and the children slept, and the mountains stood around him in the last of the light. He thought about the man he had been before October of 1874, and he thought about the man he was now, and the distance between those two men was not a failure of the first or a perfection of the second, but a long, necessary journey undertaken mostly in one cabin with one woman in one mountain range in Colorado, and it seemed to him the most important journey he had ever made. He had never once asked a woman to stay. He had not known how to ask. He had not known, if he was honest, what he was asking for, had not known what staying meant, had not been able to see beyond the solitude he had made into an identity and called it a virtue. And then she had fallen off her horse in his reign and been too proud to admit she needed anything, and had walked into his cabin and swept his floor and made his stew, and told him in January with her chin up and her heart entirely visible that she loved him. And he had stood there in the door like a man who had never been taught to open the thing being offered to him, and he had let her walk back to the fire without a word. He had found the words eventually. He had found them in March by the dying fire, and they had been insufficient words. "I want you to stay" was a pale thing next to what he had actually meant, which was, "You have given me back the part of myself I did not know I was missing. You have made the morning interesting and the winter bearable and the silence no longer too large. You have changed every room I occupy simply by being the person I know I will return to," but they had been honest, and honest had been enough. She had stayed. More than stayed, she had built. She had made a life here with the same practical, purposeful energy she brought to everything she decided to do, and the life she had built was also his life, and their children's life, and it was a real and particular and unrepeatable thing, the way all real things are. He went inside. The cabin was warm. Anna was reading at the table by the lamp, her dark hair loosened for the evening, a cup of cold coffee she had forgotten to drink at her elbow. She looked up when he came in. "Cold," she said. "Not very," he said. He sat down across from her. He looked at her in the lamplight, as he had looked at her in firelight and in morning light, and in the specific gray light of snowbound winter mornings for 9 years, and he felt the same thing he had felt in March of 1875 in the cabin doorway when she had looked at the compass and he had looked at her, that he was in the presence of something true. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He considered the question. He was a man who chose his words carefully, who had spent a long time alone with his thoughts and had learned to have most of them in silence. But he was also, after 9 years with this woman, a man who had learned that some thoughts were better said than kept. "I am thinking," he said, "that I am the luckiest man in the Colorado high country and possibly in the broader territory, and that I am aware this is not a philosophically defensible position, but I am holding it anyway." Anna set down her book. She looked at him with the expression she sometimes wore when he said something that landed on her in a particular way, not surprised, because she knew him well enough to not be surprised, but moved, the way you are moved by something you love and do not take for granted. "You are also," she said, "a man who once stood in a doorway in January and said approximately nothing in response to a woman telling him she loved him." "I am aware of that," he said, "and who then spent 2 months being pointedly courteous at me. That is also accurate. And who then very slowly and at great internal cost said 3 words into a dying fire. 3 correct words," he noted. She smiled. It was the smile she had given him first in the supply room of the Hargrove claim in December of 1874, the full, unguarded smile that had made him stare at her with a hammer in his hand and understand that he was in considerable trouble. It had not diminished in 9 years. If anything, it was larger, more familiar, more precisely itself. "They were the right words," she said, "and they were worth waiting for." He reached across the table and took her hand. She held his. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines with the low, breathing sound that had been the score of his solitary years, and was now the background music of an entirely different and infinitely better life. James slept in the next room with the serious solidity of a boy who was already, at 9, becoming someone. Ruth slept with her arms thrown out in both directions, claiming space with the instinctive confidence of a person who had always known she deserved room. Dexter Walden, 33 years old at the beginning and now 42, and no longer particularly interested in solitude as a virtue, held his wife's hand across the kitchen table in the cabin they had built together on the mountain he had chosen and she had come to love. And outside, the stars over Colorado were doing what they always did, being vast and indifferent and magnificent. And inside, the lamp burned warm and the stove clicked with its slow, satisfied heat. And the compass sat on its shelf with its needle pointing north, and everything that had ever mattered was contained within those log walls. The next spring, Anna told him there would be another child. A second son, who arrived in August of 1884 with considerably less difficulty than his predecessors, and with an immediately apparent placidity that led Dexter to privately wonder if this one had perhaps been mixed up with someone else's child, though he was wise enough not to say this aloud. They named him Henry, for no particular reason except that it sat well with him, and Henry proceeded to be the most even-tempered person in the cabin for the first 3 years of his life, which, given the competition, was no small achievement. Ruth, at 8, took immediate proprietary interest in Henry and appointed herself his primary educator in matters she considered important, which included the identification of mountain plants, the names of the star formations visible from the clearing outside the cabin, and a particular story about a coyote that she had largely invented, but told with the authority of received wisdom. James, at 10, watched all of this with the patient, slightly amused expression of a boy who had survived having Ruth for a sister, and felt confident his brother would survive it too. The family that Dexter Walden had not known he was building grew into itself with the generative, particular life of things that have found their right conditions. The cabin expanded once more in 1885, because Henry needed somewhere to be that was not directly under Ruth's educational jurisdiction, which had become considerable. The kitchen garden that Dexter had planted in the spring of 1876 was now properly established, producing vegetables through the summer months that reduced their dependency on supply trips to Ridgecrest. The trap line remained productive, though the fur trade was changing as the railroad brought easier goods to more places and the market shifted. Dexter adapted, as he had always adapted to the practical demands of mountain life, and Anna helped him think through the adaptation with the accountant's mind she had never stopped using, the practical intelligence she had brought with her from St. Louis and applied to everything since. They expanded the guiding work. Dexter had always done some, for the survey parties and occasionally for hunting parties from the eastern cities, and Anna handled the correspondence and the accounts, and it became, over the years of the late 1880s, a genuine business rather than occasional supplementary income. Chester Hargrove died in 1887 in his chair on his porch in Ridgecrest, which those who knew him considered appropriate. He had lived his life largely in the open air and had apparently decided to leave it there too. The funeral was well attended for a mining community. Chester had been known to a lot of people and owed money to very few of them, which in Ridgecrest was its own form of distinction. Dexter spoke at the graveside because Eli, who came down from his surveying work for the occasion, was not composed enough to manage it without assistance. Anna stood beside Dexter at the grave of the man who had given her work when she needed it most, the man who had shaken her hand the first time they met, and paid her fairly and never once suggested that a woman handling the records was anything but practical, and she felt the specific, bittersweet weight of gratitude and grief that is the feeling of loving someone you knew too briefly and will not see again. Eli found her afterward, before he had to return to his surveying party. He was 33 now, a lean, weathered, capable man who had done a great deal with the foundation she had helped him build in those mountain winters, and he shook her hand and then changed his mind and embraced her instead, briefly and somewhat awkwardly, and said, "Thank you for the letters and the reading and all of it. I know you know, but I wanted to say it again." "You did the work," she told him. "I only held the pencil." He shook his head. "You held the whole thing," he said, and went to find his horse. The 1890s came with their changes and their complications, as decades do. The railroad reached closer to the mountain communities, which brought both convenience and the kind of development pressure that Dexter watched with the mixed feelings of a man who understood the practical benefits and mourned the particular wildness that had defined the country he loved. He was in his 50s now, still physically capable of the mountain work, but moving through it with the slightly more deliberate pace of a man who had accumulated a full complement of old injuries and had made peace with them. Anna was in her 40s and was, by any honest assessment, herself in the fullest possible sense, a woman who had grown into the life she had chosen with the organic rightness of a plant in its correct soil. She corresponded regularly with her mother, who had written her increasingly long and personal letters over the years, and who had eventually made the startling announcement in 1888 that she had left Anna's father, a development that was so far outside the imaginable frame of Anna's childhood that she had to read the letter 3 times before it resolved into fact. Her mother had gone to live with a sister in Cincinnati, and by all accounts was managing very well. Anna's father wrote once more, a brief and stiff letter that said very little, and after that there was silence from that quarter, which Anna had made her peace with in the way that one makes peace with the particular shape of one's family, not without feeling, but without the illusion that feeling can change what is fixed. James went east to study in 1895, which was its own kind of leaving, the first departure of a child who had grown up entirely on the mountain into a world that was wide and complex, and outside his parents' direct knowledge. He wrote letters home with a regularity that spoke to his character, detailed and observant, full of his reactions to the eastern cities, that had the quality of a person trained to pay attention encountering something very different from everything he knew. He was, Anna wrote to Clara, her father's eyes in an unfamiliar country. Ruth stayed in the mountains. She married at 22, a choice that surprised no one who knew her. A geologist named Thomas Archer who came through on a survey of the San Juan Range and made the error of condescending to her about what she thought she knew about the local rock formations, and who spent the rest of the afternoon being comprehensively corrected and apparently finding this more attractive than most people found ordinary conversation. Dexter liked Thomas, who was direct and honest and smart enough to know when he was wrong, which were the primary qualities Dexter required in a person. Anna liked him because he looked at Ruth the way Dexter looked at her, which is to say, with the full and unhidden attention of someone who finds a person genuinely extraordinary. Ruth and Thomas built a cabin a mile south of Anna and Dexter's, which meant family dinners were a matter of a short walk through the aspens rather than a long correspondence, and Ruth could continue the mountain work she had always done. She was already something of a natural authority on the local plant life, and had begun keeping records of her own that Thomas encouraged with the honest enthusiasm of a man who had married someone he considered more interesting than himself. Henry grew up slow and steady and good, in the way of some people who seemed to have arrived already settled, as if they had worked out their necessary turmoil in some previous arrangement, and had this life to simply live. He took an interest in the guiding business and was naturally suited to it, calm in difficult terrain, easy with people who were frightened or uncertain, possessed of a patience for crisis that made both his parents quietly grateful. By the time he was in his mid-20s, he was the primary guide in the family operation, with Dexter in a supervisory and advisory capacity that suited the age and stage of both of them. And so the years laid themselves down like snow, each one covering the last and building up the foundation on which the next would rest. And the life that had begun in a rainstorm in 1874 grew and thickened and branched into something that neither Dexter nor Anna could have imagined when they were the single man alone in the mountains, and the woman running from a future she had not chosen. In the autumn of 1901, Dexter Walden was 60 years old and still living in the cabin he had built in his 20s, though the cabin now had 4 rooms and a porch, and a window on the south side that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the kitchen bright and warm on November mornings. He woke on the anniversary morning of the rainstorm near enough, he thought, near enough, and lay in the quiet of early morning listening to the mountain breathe. Anna was asleep beside him, her hair fully silver now, and spread across the pillow in a way that he found as beautiful as he had found it 27 years ago. She slept the way she did most things, with a quality of intention, as if even in rest she was doing it properly. She would wake in an hour and make coffee, and the cabin would fill with that smell that was as fundamental to his life as the smell of the pines outside. He lay there in the gray morning light, and he thought about how he had been, once, a man who believed he was built for solitude. He thought about the cold exactness of a life lived alone, how clean and manageable it was, how it demanded nothing and gave nothing, how it was the life of a man who had decided not to risk anything. He thought about a gray mare named Pepper throwing a woman off in a thunderstorm. He thought about River Ice eyes looking at a woman in the rain and thinking, that one is going to be remarkable if she survives the night. He thought about January and a cold doorway, and the most honest and brave and terrifying thing anyone had ever said to him, said in the direct, clear voice of a woman who had decided that honesty mattered more than outcome. He thought about a dying fire and 3 words and a compass, and a ring the color of altitude sky. He thought about 27 years of mornings when the cabin was not empty, and the silences were chosen rather than default, and the lamp was lit, as Anna had once said, because there was a good reason to light it. He thought, I did not ask her to stay. I almost did not ask at all. She was already reaching for the door when I finally found the words. And she had already decided to stay before I asked, not because I had earned it, but because she had seen something in the man who stood in the rain with a lantern and a wall-eyed gray horse that she had decided was worth staying for. He was grateful every day that she had decided before he managed to ask. He was going to be grateful every day for whatever days remained. He was not a man who made speeches, internally or otherwise, and so he stopped thinking in sentences and simply lay in the quiet of the morning and the warmth of the blankets and the sleeping presence of his wife, and felt the full weight of the life he had and called it, with complete honesty and no sentimentality whatsoever, enough. Anna woke. She turned over and looked at him. She had always been able to tell when he was awake from the particular quality of his stillness, not the slack stillness of sleep, but the attentive stillness of Dexter Walden thinking. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. "What time is it?" "Early," he said. "Not yet 6. She settled back against the pillow. Outside the window, the mountain was beginning to lighten along the ridge. "It smells like snow coming," she said. "Tonight, I think," he agreed. They lay in the early light and listened to the mountain waking around them, the birds beginning and the wind moving in the aspens and the specific, irreplaceable sound of the place they had lived their whole lives together in. "Dexter," she said, "do you know what today is?" He looked at the ceiling. "Near enough to the anniversary of a rainstorm," he said. She laughed softly. "Near enough," she agreed. They lay together in the light that was growing now, the sun finding the south window the way it always did in October mornings, laying a bar of gold across the floorboards where Henry had slept as a baby and where a braided rug now covered the wood. Outside Ruth and Thomas's cabin a mile south, the smoke would be rising. James was in Denver in a law office, doing what his mother's mind and his father's precision and his own particular character had made of him. Henry was in the main barn below the cabin, already up and checking on the horses with the reliable early morning industry that was simply who he was. All of it real, all of it resolved into the good weight of the actual. Anna sat up and pushed her silver hair back and swung her feet to the floor with the decisive morning efficiency of a woman who had things to do and was interested in doing them, which she had been every morning of the 27 years of their married life, and which he hoped to observe for every morning that remained. "I will make the coffee," she said. "I will bring in the wood," he said. He rose and pulled on his coat and his boots and went out into the early mountain morning, which was cold and clear and brilliant in the specific way of Colorado October mornings, with the aspens doing their last gold performance before the winter took them, and the peaks white already above the tree line, and the air so clean and cold it tasted like the first honest thing he had ever known. He filled his arms with firewood from the stack beside the cabin. He stood for a moment in the cold morning light, looking at the mountains that had been his country for more than 30 years, that had given him the particular silence he had needed, and then, at exactly the right moment and in exactly the right way, had given him the rainstorm. He went inside. The door closed behind him. The cabin was warm. Anna was at the stove, reaching for the coffee tin, and she was saying something over her shoulder about whether Ruth was coming to dinner, and whether he thought the trail would be clear enough before the snow came tonight. And he set the firewood by the stove and answered her and took off his coat and sat down at the table where he had sat for 27 years of mornings with this woman. The compass was on its shelf, pointing north, always north, steady as the thing it represented. The lamp burned on the table between them. Outside the mountain stood, and the aspens shook their last gold coins in the autumn light, and the snow that was coming tonight was still hours away, and for now there was only the clear and brilliant morning and the smell of coffee and the sound of his wife's voice and the long, good, particular life of Dexter Walden, who had never once asked a woman to stay, who had almost let the right one go, who had found the words too late and then just in time, and who had been living in the glad consequence of those 3 honest words ever since.